you give us time? Yeah.
Yes. The first question would be addressed to...
I'll open. I don't welcome.
Yes.
We do.
Hello, Caroline.
Bonjour. Hello.
Good afternoon. I'm Gene Policinski, the Chief Operating Officer of the Newseum Institute. I'd like to welcome you to the night studio at the Newseum. A welcome to those of you here in the studio, those of you watching the live stream at newseuminstitute.org, and those of you joining us on C-SPAN 2. We're glad to have you with us. The Newseum and its programs and the Newseum Institute, its outreach and programs partner, comprise the only organization in the world dedicated to free expression and the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. That is religion, speech, press, assembly, and petition. We work to ensure that those fundamental freedoms remain strong and protected both today and for future generations. Our exhibits, education efforts, and programs online and in person, we hope inform all and remind all of us of the importance and yet at the same time the fragility of those basic human rights to express ideas, to express our opinions, to worship freely. And we hope that we help you explore the freedom and the meaning of freedom in an age of continual technological innovation. By embracing the role as a neutral forum committed to open and robust discussion, the Newseum and the Newseum Institute engage in, we hope, the central debates of our time, including the future of investigative journalism, tension between national security and privacy, the role of religious freedom, and the role of a free press and free expression worldwide. We gathered today to recall that 1 year ago on January 7th, terrorists invaded the Paris offices of the French weekly newspaper Charlie Hebdo. And in the name of, as I believe the terrorists said, punishing the staff for the perceived blasphemy of publishing satirical cartoons of the Muslim prophet Muhammad, 12 people died, were murdered. But in that process, in those murders, the concept of free expression worldwide was challenged. After that initial terror attack, there were many reactions. Most immediately, millions in France and really around the world adopted the slogan, as we see on a t-shirt here or a sweatshirt here, Je suis Charlie, I am Charlie, as an expression of support for both those journalists and others who died in the attack, but also for the concept of free expression and even perhaps the right to offend. Elsewhere, those deaths, if we're honest, were seen as the inevitable outcome, if not the appropriate punishment, to a perceived blasphemy. And in this past year, those responses have all continued. They've been as varied as calls for increased support for free expression, but also restrictions on Muslims in France and elsewhere in the world on how they practice their faith, new laws on freedom of expression and even immigration, and at times, in the US, in terms of the First Amendment, even a call to re-examine an old standard that has kept the government from restraining free speech, a standard called clear and present danger, in which there is a need to revisit that in a time when terrorists can reach out via the web and electronically rather than being physically present. Before we move into our discussion, we should also note that this is the 75th anniversary of another event, one that marked a more hopeful moment, if not period, for freedom and free expression, and that is US President Franklin Roosevelt's 4 Freedoms speech delivered on January 6, 1941. Of course, at the time, those 4 freedoms that Roosevelt enumerated, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear, were voiced at a time when the world stood on the brink of what would become World War I. Of course, the battle had already begun in Europe. America would enter it only about a little less than 12 months later. But those 4 freedoms symbolized what the goal of the United States and ultimately the Allies and what was to become the United Nations stood for in that fight. They were incorporated in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations in 1948. A former museum colleague of ours, Paul Sparrow, now heads the FDR Presidential Library and Museum in Hyde Park, New York. And in a blog this morning, he wrote, "As tyrannical leaders once again result to brutal oppression and terrorism to achieve their goals, as democracy and even journalism are under attack from extremists around the globe, and as even surveillance and technology threaten individual liberties and freedom of expression, FDR's bold vision of these four freedoms is as vital as it was 75 years ago." I would only add that those five freedoms of the First Amendment, and as our CEO, Jeffrey Herbst, noted after the terror attacks in November 14th in Paris, for a nation and a city intrinsically tied to liberty, those cowardly acts still seek to diminish our democratic rights and our freedom of expression. The Museum Institute, Reporters Without Borders, and the Washington Foreign Law Society are pleased to present this program today. And really, we hope to discuss the issues raised by this terrible incident one day short of a year ago. It is, for me, the embodiment of the best response to these attacks, that the marketplace of ideas still exists, and that we can have a robust discussion worldwide about the very basic rights and freedoms of humanity that held true in 1791, in 1941, and again in 2016. And with that, let me present our moderator, Delphine Algan from Reporters Without Borders. Delphine.
Thank you, Jean, and thank you really for all your amazing work and all the amazing work of your colleague here at the museum and the Museum Institute to champion the First Amendment freedoms. Thank you for hosting us. Thank you for co-organizing it with Reporters Without Borders and the Washington Foreign Law Society to commemorate today the first anniversary of Charlie Hebdo's tragedy. As you know, Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières, is the largest press freedom organization in the world. We report on press freedom violation all around the world thanks to a network of local journalists reporting for us in 130 countries in order to monitor all press freedom violation. Actually, 1 year ago, I was working at our Paris office in Paris on January 7th. And 1 year after, I still don't have the right words to express the shock. And attacking a newsroom with automatic weapons in the heart of Paris was something we could hardly imagine. And actually, Paris was attacked again. And we were even more hurt just a few months ago. At RSF, actually, we observed that these last years have been marked by an extreme level of violence targeting journalists. We all have in mind the carefully staged beheadings of journalists, now Charlie Hebdo attacks, or the increase of kidnappings. 110 journalists have been killed in 2015, 110. The deadliest countries were Syria, Iraq, and France. So I look forward to our discussion today with such prominent panelists. I really want to thank Caroline Forest to be with us by Skype from Paris. And of course, I will start with her today to hear from her. But I want to thank, of course, Robert Cohn-River, Renaud Bochard, Jean Policinski, and Adas Gold. Thank you so much all for being here. So, in a sense, today, we want to discuss what has changed for freedom of expression, freedom of the press, and liberty of religion in France, in the US, and around the world since Charlie Hebdo attack. How does the press cover religion? What are the differences between freedom of expression in France, in the US? What are the red lines? Are there differences? How has blasphemy law or national security law impacted basic freedoms? How should we respond to the information war launched by groups such as ISIS on social media? So that are some of the questions I really look forward to discussing with you all. But to start, I want to introduce you to Caroline Forest. She's a very well-renowned journalist. She's the editor of Pro-Choix magazine, and she's a former contributor of Charlie Hebdo. And Caroline, you just published an essay, Éloge du blasphème, in praise of blasphemy, why Charlie Hebdo is not Islamophobic. And according to Salman Rushdie, this is a vitally important book. So actually, the book is available in English on ebook, so I all invite you to read it because it's vitally important to read it. So actually, Caroline, you know, just after the attacks, Charlie Hebdo has been portrayed by some people as Islamophobic. But when I met Gérard Biard or Jean-Baptiste Torre, when they came here in the US to receive the PEN America Awards, actually they pointed out that in 10 years, between 2005 and 2015, out of a total of approximately 500 Charlie Hebdo issues, only 38 covers were dedicated to religion and 7 to Islam. So, Caroline, I just think it's important to start by explaining what is Charlie Hebdo, how important are cartoons in France, how, if you can tell us how Charlie Hebdo staff is today, are they still under police protection? And then I will ask you to talk to us about how the French press react and more about your essay. But first, yes, can you explain briefly what is Charlie Hebdo and how is Charlie Hebdo staff today?
Yes, thank you so much, Delphine, to giving me this opportunity to speak about this legendary newspaper who was already a legend before the 7th of January, before this drama. For the anti-racist left I do belong to, it's not only the newspaper that you know today described as Islamophobic just because they dare mock fanatics from all religions, including Islamists. Charlie Hebdo is also mostly known in France as one of the most anti-racist newspapers. During the 80s and the 90s more, because before it was individual, but during the 90s, all the movements against racism, like SOS Racisme, we did fight the anti-Arab racism in France, took their cartoons from Charb, from Honoré, from people who are dead today. And not only dead, who are described as Islamophobic and racist after they're dead. This is incredibly painful. You cannot imagine. It's like if they are dead twice, actually. When I have to explain and again how much those guys were open-minded, were deeply anti-racist and strongly open to every culture and the most brilliant, talented and funny guys I ever known. And that people can twisted their intention, twisted their cartoons, put them out of their context to help the propaganda of the killers. Because this is actually what those people are doing. And I really want to point it out. I really want to insist on that. It's not only unprofessional, for example, as journalists, to describe Charlie Hebdo as Islamophobic. It's not only wrong and false, it is dangerous. Because this word, Islamophobia, with confusing the secularist intention, the fact that an atheist satirical newspaper wants to be able to laugh about fanatism, whatever it is, fanatics from Islam, fanatism from Judaism, or fanatism from Christianism, describing it as racist against Muslims by calling them Islamophobic. It's not only wrong and false, it is really, really dangerous. It is putting a target on the head of those journalists, on those cartoonists. It's already killed those people. It's maybe going to kill tomorrow the other who have been called Islamophobic still today. And to answer to your question, how is Charlie Hebdo today? How they are living today? They are living like prisoners. They are living hell because they are all under police protection. Rhys, the editor-in-chief of Charlie Hebdo, have been you know that the Shab has been already really targeted by Al-Qaeda. Now it's Reis who is targeted today, and not only by terrorist group, also by, for example, a Pakistani very famous politician who said he will pay for everyone who is going to kill Reis. We are in that crazy situation today. And this is why it's so important first to stop to call secularist or atheist or just, again, anti-racist but secularist, cartoonist and journalist Islamophobic when they are just who they are, which is the opposite. It's important to even to stop to use that word, actually. If you want to target the real racism, we do exist, and that Charlie Hebdo is denouncing when he's fighting against National Front, for example, but not only, then you should say words or act anti-Muslims. And at least it is clear, it's not saying phobia against Islam, but phobia against Muslims. And phobia against Muslims is really speaking about racism, which is something we all want to fight against.
So thank you, Caroline. I just want to go more into what you explain in your essay. And in your essay, I think you talk about une mondialisation de l'intimidation, what I could translate as a global intimidation. Can you tell us what you mean exactly?
I mean that one of the most danger that journalists are facing today in the world, and also cartoonists, is not only censorship or intimidation coming from states. We know that. We know how to react to that. But I would say that today probably it's even worse. It's the intimidation coming from movements on the ground who are not states, or maybe like ISIL, a terrorist state, and who can kill to silence you, to forbid you to speak, to forbid you to criticize. And today, among the journalists who died this year that you did mention, most of them have been killed by terrorist groups and not censored by states. So we are really in the middle of this tornado because we are facing the necessity of defending freedom of speech, freedom also to fight sometimes when states are taking, of course, measure against the freedom to fight against terrorism. But in the same time, our first priority today, even in France, is to stay alive. And when you're a journalist who, as you, Delphine, I did, including for Charlie Hebdo, I did many papers on the Salman Rushdie affair, on the assassination of Theo van Gogh. I did follow so many cases of accusation of blasphemy. But what did change this year is that before I was used to consider that those lives were in danger in Pakistan, that Taslima Nasrin actually is in danger in India, which is a democracy. And Salman Rushdie did face those threats far before us in London. Mm-hmm. And so you see more and more, it's not only living under theocratic state with dangerous. Living in democracy is dangerous too for journalists, for free thinkers. And I would add that which is more painful. And if you read the autobiography of Salman Rushdie, it is so well explained. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What is the more painful part? It's not only that you have to face death threats and to live under police protection and not to be able to free anymore. But when you are hearing comments or attacks coming from the Democrats, not only coming from the fanatics or the terrorists are playing their role, I mean, but when Democrats are helping the terrorists by accusing people of, again, being Islamophobic or going too far or being provocative, unnecessary when they are just defending freedom of expression.
Yeah, I think it's a great transition point to the point I wanted to raise with Robert Cornriver. He's actually one of the U.S. leading First Amendment lawyers. And recently, actually, you worked on many cases related to limitation of free speech on American universities' campus, which could seem very weird, I think, from France to hear about that. But actually, there's a lot of limitation of free speech in the campus, last years. So would you say that the US are becoming excessively politically correct? Or how did you see freedom of expression and freedom of the press evolve in the US this last year?
Great question, Delphine. Thanks for that. And I think there is a real connection between what's going on American campuses and what we're seeing as a global phenomenon and discussions about the meaning and extent of freedom of expression. The question comes down to, do you protect the right to offend, or do you protect a right not to be offended? And the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is predicated on, and decisions have reinforced the notion, that we don't have freedom unless there is a freedom to offend. And that has been decided in cases involving many different scenarios over the years, that all of our freedoms depend on being able to protect the rights of people who offend us the most. But I think it's important to stress that freedom of expression is a much bigger concept than just what the First Amendment provides. The First Amendment is our local ordinance in the United States. We're very proud of it. We think it's a model for how you protect freedom of expression. But freedom of expression is both broader as a concept than just what the law provides. And legal systems around the world have various kinds of protections for freedom of expression, including the ones in Europe under the European Convention for Human Rights, which provide more of a balancing approach that balance other interests against the primary concern in freedom of expression. But to measure the impact on free speech overall, I think it gets back to this issue of global intimidation that we heard about. That's bigger than a legal issue. And to really assess the health of freedom of expression, you have to look first at the legal structures, but secondly, at the level of courage that citizens are willing to exercise. There are very frightening and intimidating factors. What was known in American law as the heckler's veto has become the assassin's veto. The heckler's veto is a concept that evolved during the Civil Rights era, when people would threaten to silence civil rights marchers. And the notion developed in the law that we can't permit the hecklers to limit the rights of those people who are trying to make their point. But now it's become much more sinister and much more deadly with the notion of the assassin's veto. And so I think it's a natural question to ask, how courageous are we being when it comes to these expressions? I mean, it's one thing to wear a J. Swiss Charlie button. It's quite another if your editorial board decides not to publish any of the images from Charlie Hebdo, as most U.S. newspapers have not in the wake of all of the events in Paris. And so I think it's important to assess.
How do you explain that?
People are scared. I think that there is a global intimidation. I mean, you can see it not just in that example, but you can also see it in an example like the disruption of the premiere of the film The Interview, after North Korea threatened retaliation if this silly parody made American theaters. I bought a copy of the CD. I figured it was my duty to do so in light of everything. And not a great movie, but I'm glad I bought it. I'm glad I saw it. And so, you have to ask yourself, what if other basic freedoms were threatened by threats of violence? If foreign powers or individuals in foreign governments decided that other aspects of the First Amendment were simply things that they couldn't tolerate? What if, for example, a foreign government or foreign terrorists decided it really offends them if people attend church services in the United States or anywhere? How would we assess the behavior of people if they decided, oh, well, I'm sorry, I can't go to church. They said they'd hurt me. It's understandable to be afraid when there are real threats, and there are real threats. But if we don't find some kind of collective courage, then we lose freedom of expression, regardless of what the law says.
Thank you, Bob. I will maybe turn now to Renaud Bochard, the other Frenchie at the table with me, and Caroline by Skype. Renaud, you're an adjunct professor at American University, Washington College of Law, and a fellow of the French Institute of High Judicial Studies. You recently translated into French Justice Breyer's latest book, The Court and the World. And I guess with your background with the Washington Foreign Law Society to promote knowledge and understanding of international legal matters, I wanted to come to the professor in you and ask you to explain to us the differences between freedom of expression, freedom of the press in France and in the US. Tell us about this hate speech prosecution we are seeing in France and how Charlie Hebdo has been prosecuted many times. Can you explain that very simple to the students we are?
Okay, so I think the beginning is actually to look at the texts themselves. I mean, if you look at the First Amendment, Congress shall make no laws. That's a very unique way of expressing freedom of speech. Then, when you look at the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, you have a very different form of expressing freedom of speech. I can read just, Article 10 of the Declaration. Which says, no one shall be dissuaded on account of his opinion, including religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb public order. And then in Article 11, which is more on point about actual freedom of speech, it ends that saying every citizen may speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuse of freedom and as shall be defined by law. You have very, very different way to express those basic freedom. Then what happens is, in fact, you have, the law, the statute of 1881, which determine what's the framework, the framework statute on freedom of the press. And what you see is that statute has remained quite unchanged until one very important date, I think, is 1990. And 1990 is a statute called the Loi Guesso. And the Loi Guesso adds in the statute, Loi Guesso created that crime for negation of a crime against humanity, and it added in the Article 24 of the Statute of 1881 an offense of inciting racism or racial hatred. It all proceeded with very good intention, except that I think that explains why there is no substitute. It's extremely dangerous to legislate on matter of freedom of expression, because it creates a situation where basically gradually we went to a situation which now is characteristic of the problem we face with Islamophobia, and it's that the threat to extend the de facto censorship to matters of race, it's extending, in fact, to matters of religion and beyond, and even to the expression, the political act done in religious name. So that's why you have right now in France that chilling effect of Islamophobia. Everybody criticize me, not only will criticize Islam in general, but will criticize, in fact, Salafism. Is now labeled a racist, basically. It's in fact, the Muslims, which are, they are essentialized as a whole unique community. In a way, they are the new wretched of the earth. In what we see right now, they are the ultimate expression of racism, and that's why now you have in fact that develops more within the French left. It's even called Islamo-leftism. You have that chilling effect. You have people who say no. Even the Salafist predication, you cannot criticize the Salafist, and you add on top of that another tendency, which I think here is something that, in fact, derives more from something from a global attitude and from an American posture, which is this kind of fear of any interruption of circulation of flows. And in fact, flows, flows of speech, of money. And in fact, when you see that money is equated with speech, you have basically all the Saudi money and Turkish and Qatari, which flows, which circulate freely all over the world. And in fact, it's considered the moment, to say you need to limit the flows that come from Saudi Arabia is in fact limiting freedom of religion. And I think that is extremely dangerous. So we see some perfect illustration of the slippery slope.
So, Bob, would you say that there's no limits to the First Amendment freedoms, or what are the limits
Oh, no,
of the
there
First
of
Amendment?
course there are
freedoms?
limits. And you know, some critics of the First Amendment will say that people are too interested in an absolutist view of the First Amendment. It's more of a pejorative than it is an argument, because I don't know of court decisions, any court decisions, that defend the First Amendment as an absolute freedom. And frankly, I don't know of any serious people who defend it on that basis either, because obviously it doesn't protect simply the use of words. You can't go into a bank and hand a note to the teller that says, "Give me all your money," and say that you're protected by the First Amendment, because after all you've done is used your words. And so there are limits by the rule of law. And the way that line has been drawn by the courts has typically been whether is the threat of violence, the realistic threat of violence. So the test for incitement, for example, is whether or not the speaker intends to bring about an immediate violent breach of the peace, and whether or not those words are likely to cause that immediate breach of the peace. There are certain very specific categories that the court has said are unprotected by the First Amendment over the years. Cases have refined that list and narrowed it quite a bit over the years. And that's in sharp contrast to what you see under the European Convention of Human Rights, for example, where instead of having a limited list of words that are types of speech that are not protected, you have sort of an amorphous and possibly expanding list of concepts that are not protected by the First Amendment. The government's ability to regulate speech in the United States based on its content is governed by a standard called strict scrutiny, which puts the burden on the government to prove that there is a compelling need to restrict speech, and it requires the government to use the least restrictive means of restricting speech, whereas in Europe, the concept is called proportionality. And you have a measure of appreciation that where the European Court of Human Rights will sort of err on the side of governments being able to enforce laws in favor of whatever the national interest was that prompted the restriction. So there are different ways of looking at the two. The difference is that in the American system, we err on the side of protecting speech rather than err on the side of government power. And so it's not an absolute view, but it is a more speech protective view than you find in the rest of the world.
So maybe let's go to the media reporter here, Adas Gold. You were born in Tel Aviv and you cover the media industry and the political world. So I'm curious to hear your views on how religions have been covered during this crazy US election campaign. I mean, from Donald Trump's comments on Muslims to religiously correctness. Where are we exactly, or how do you see this debate in that perspective?
Before I start, I do want to say, if you want to read an excerpt of Caroline's wonderful essay, Politico.eu, I work for Politico, we actually just today published it. Highly recommend, but also buy the ebook as well. But no, it has been an incredibly fascinating time on the campaign trail, things that you never thought would be said and said by candidates and candidates that they would somehow still be candidates after they said them, has really been fascinating. And in a way, you find yourself almost, and it's almost like this, we've said a tornado, a catch-22, where on one hand, obviously, a lot of these candidates want to protect, they say they want to protect free speech and freedom of religion, but they're calling for databases of a certain type of religion. And in terms of how the media covers it, I've never, and granted I'm young, I haven't covered that many elections. I don't think the media has ever been in such a situation where they find themselves wanting to be objective and cover things straight down the line, but having to cover something with a straight face that they might find obscene. And only in the last couple of months have I started to see the media actually start to react and calling what some people might consider a spade, and yet you still see them restricting themselves, holding themselves back a little bit because of this sanctity of the objectiveness of the press in the United States, which is different from Europe, where where reporters, I feel like, feel much more willing to state what they view as ridiculous or not, whereas in the United States we have this, you could almost consider journalism this objective journalism a religion. You have some people who adhere to it, who say, nope, I am an objective journalist. I will never say who I vote for. I'll never say if I'm registered. I will never say that somebody's ridiculous. I can say some say that, such and such is ridiculous. And then you have this kind of new form, these new journalists, I would call them, who we've seen it, for example, at BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed is a big millennial site where the editor-in-chief has said, you know what, you on social media, you as a reporter, you're allowed to call Donald Trump a racist if you believe so, and because what he has said is racist.
So, Renaud, do you think Donald Trump could have been prosecuted for hate speech in France?
Oh, definitely, yes.
Yes.
Jean, I'm a big fan of Jean, I have to confess. But Jean is now the head and the chief operating officer of the Museum Institute. But he has been a journalist for 45 years.
Yes.
You are one of the founders of the USA Today, and you write a weekly national column called Inside the First Amendment. So let's go inside the First Amendment. How do you see this danger of religious correctness in the media? Is this a real threat to journalistic freedom, to this freedom to make us laugh, to this freedom to offend?
Well, you know what, it's interesting, and listening to us mention this religion almost of objectivity. That's certainly been the religion that most journalists adhered to throughout my lifetime. There was always a journalism of opinion. We started out with journalism of opinion, actually, and the First Amendment was adopted to protect these very vitrolic editors who took sides in elections, who were sometimes funded by the candidates themselves. I disagree just a touch on the idea.
Please do.
Thank you. That editors didn't publish the cartoons either in 2005 and 6 when they first came up through the Danish press, and then in Europe, and then again around the time of Charlie Hebdo, because I think that the editorial process there, and it's the First Amendment's freedom to publish that almost in a perverse way allows you not to publish. Because if we're really honest, particularly in 2006, after the initial publishing in Denmark of the cartoons about the Muslim prophet Muhammad, much of that publication came about to show that you could, either to stand up to laws that were in place or laws that had been in place and repealed, but which someone would fear would come back. So there was almost a lack of a journalistic reason to publish. There were some, but it was really more of a statement saying, I could publish this if I want to for all these reasons. Having the right to publish also gives you the freedom to decide as an editor not to publish.
Well, of course.
And
of course.
so
But how do you tell that story?
Yeah.
Without publishing the cover of Charlie Hebdo after the massacre?
Oh, and again, after the cover, after the killings, you have to show that cover. And we did here at the museum. I've been honest, I participated in that discussion.
But many did not.
It was a question.
But I think the decision initially, and to some degree with the cover, was to say what editors always do, which is it will offend a sizable or some portion of my readership. I can describe those original cartoons in a manner that let people understand them without having to necessarily publish them. And repetitive publishing. I also draw a distinction, I guess, between on cable news where this thing was repeated over and over and over again, where I'm utterly familiar with those cartoons, and it's the 107th time they're being shown, where there was, there was no need there for understanding. There was no benefit of understanding. So I think that, the First Amendment basically says to editors, and still does in the United States, you have this right to make a decision about what you'll publish. When it comes to religious, to blasphemy, we have no effective blasphemy laws in the U.S. And I think the solution has been, unlike in Europe, where there is and there worries me a little bit about, again, this call to re-examine our clear and present danger standard, that there is a necessity for the law to step in. We've relied on the marketplace of ideas, that if, no matter how offensive, no matter what the repugnant, repellent language or imagery that might be put out, absent that clear and present danger, that immediate threat, that realistic threat, the answer is more speech, not less. The restriction inevitably, to me, produces this pushback, may glorify the banned speaker. It has, I think, over history shown it's ineffective, and particularly in the age of the internet, you're not going to stamp out an idea. If I didn't publish that cartoon as an editor in, and I'll just pick a city, sorry, no reason to do this other than Moline, Illinois. If I didn't publish it in Moline, Illinois, and maybe you did, if you're looking, but if you didn't, You did that with the certainty that there was absolutely no barrier to 95% of your audience seeing that imagery somewhere. And in fact, some editors chose to take the issue that we won't put it on a front page image or an image that's static that you pass by, that you are not a willing recipient of that information, but we'll give you a link to a website where you can be an active participant. You may make the decision to look at it. Again, some people criticize that as cowardly or just ducking the issue. I think there was some purchase from some editors who said, if I'm in the rack or if I'm on a table or I'm invisible in somewhere, people can be an unwilling person seeing that. If you make the conscious decision, look, fine, and we'll provide it for you. So you
Yeah.
didn't give up the news
Gene,
operation.
if I could just
Yeah.
pick up on your points about editorial standards. First, the notion of whether or not journalism must be or must have the pretense of objectivity. I mean, I wonder, where is H.L. Mencken now that we need him so desperately? Can you imagine him covering this presidential campaign? It would just be priceless.
Yeah.
And the closest thing we've had to that is Jon Stewart, and sadly he's no longer on The Daily Show. With respect to your points about the right not to publish, obviously, the right to speak involves the right not to speak. And when newspapers or other publications make editorial decisions, that's editing, not censorship. Okay, so it's important to draw a distinction there. But there is a serious difference between having an editorial policy, for example, that says you're not going to publish four-letter words, even though you have every right under the First Amendment to publish them, and not publishing something because there is an external threat saying, if you publish that, we will kill you. And that's the situation we have here that makes it so radically different from
Yeah.
anything else that we face.
Just before you answer, I just want really I think I like this fact that actually blasphemy allegation are used to restrict free speech all over the world, in Bangladesh, in Russia, and we're talking about nearly half of the world countries have actually laws penalizing blasphemy. And 8 of these countries are members of the European Union. But of course, we think of Bangladesh, Saudi Arabia, where the blogger, by example, Raif Badawi, was sentenced for insulting Islam to 1,000 lashes. Yeah. So we are talking about these laws against our self-censorship, which is an insidious danger.
And lest we forget, just in this year, we've had people in Bangladesh hacked to death in different circumstances for raising questions about religion. So the intimidation is not, as you really would note, limited to just journalists being afraid, but I think now there's this larger threat of anyone who speaks out.
Well, and let's not just focus on Islam, because these sort of anti-blasphemy notions infect all kinds of national laws. In October of this last year, the Polish Supreme Court upheld a $1,200 euro fine against the rock performer Doda because she said that the Bible was written by people drunk with wine and smoking some stuff, and that she believes more in dinosaurs than in the Bible. And that, by the way, was upheld as being a perfectly acceptable law. The Monty Python classic, Life of Brian, was banned in certain countries. As a matter of fact, it was banned in Norway, and in Sweden they ran ads saying, "It's so funny, it was banned in Norway." And so you have these kinds of laws that exist, and the kind of malleable protections for freedom of expression under the European Convention uphold those kinds of laws. So again, it's not confined just to Islam.
And if I just round out my observations about why editors didn't publish at the time, I think it now, as these threats increase, as we see this isn't just the threat of the moment, I think there probably is more necessity to say, I'm going to publish. I think I'm generally in favor of publishing everything, but I suspect editors now would say, balancing that idea of offending someone in their audience, it's such an ongoing, continuing, and growing threat across the line that I think now editors probably would make somewhat different decisions than they might have even made a year ago, because the context is so different, this necessity to stand up to what is clearly now not just an isolated incident or a two-time kind of, but now this constant push to restrain, restrict, and intimidate. I think as an editor, you probably will have a different decision to
Can
make
I
in
ask
terms of that.
Caroline a question?
Yes.
Caroline, what do you, in your opinion, do you understand newspapers such as the New York Times not publishing the cartoons And or do you feel as though in the aftermath, I know you refer to this in your essay, but do you feel as though in the aftermath they should have as a show of solidarity? Or do you understand where some of them kind of went around, as we said, they would link to coverage of it elsewhere so as not to publish it themselves?
No, I will explain to you why. Because when we decided in Charlie Hebdo, I think there is a problem with the sound. It's okay?
Yes.
When we decided in Charlie Hebdo in 2006 to publish the Danish cartoons of the Jyllands-Posten on the Prophet Muhammad, it was absolutely for the pleasure, absolutely not. Just for you to know, myself, I've seen those cartoons 3 months before the polemic started worldwide, because an Iranian colleague of mine did show me those cartoons and asked me, is Charlie Hebdo want to publish them? And I did answer to him at that time, maybe it's really cartoons for the Danish debate, but in Charlie Hebdo we have our own publication, we don't need to publish those cartoons. But when 3 months after that, when the campaign to kill the Danish cartoonist, to the death threats against the Jyllands-Posten started, and not only in Denmark but worldwide, when some embassy did burn in Syria, in Iran, and that all actually the Danish citizens were under death threats because of those cartoons of the Jyllands-Posten. Our decision in Charlie Hebdo was first a journalistically one. It was just to say we're going to speak about this polemic, of course, but how we can speak about this polemic without showing the cartoons? It's just not making any sense from the journalist point of view. And when 10 years after, when my colleagues have been killed in the name of publishing and showing those cartoons, when I've been myself personally and many others harassed by journalists from USA, journalists from UK, to see the cover of Charlie Hebdo who is going to answer to that slaughter. And when I did see the cover, was really the sweetest one in the world. I mean, again, this Mohammed saying, "Je suis Charlie," crying and saying everything is forgiven. Yes. When they did see the cartoons, they did start to criticize it without showing it. So, sorry, this is my cat. I found myself in a strange position after a very, very hard day, being interviewed by Sky News, hearing for the 1 million times more critics about these cartoons that nobody were showing, that people could not have a judgment about that. And when I tried simply to show it, because as a journalist mostly, I wanted just people to have their own idea on the cartoon. They did cut the live, they censored me, and plus they did express their huge they apologize actually, not for cutting me from the life, but for the believers who could be shocked by almost the view of Charlie Hebdo. Can you imagine what is the message of that? The message is what Charlie Hebdo is doing is deeply wrong. They are doing something so horrible that you cannot even see it. We cannot show it in TV. And to answer to your question about New York Times during the cartoons affair about, again, the Danish cartoons about Mohammed, did unbelievable papers against Charlie Hebdo. Some that I believe personally that put us in danger because they twisted completely what we have done. And they refused to show the cartoons, of course. But for example, when there is a polemic on another blasphemy case, when there is a Catholic league who did attack a painting in USA, what did the New York Times? They did speak about the polemic, and of course they did show the painting was accused of being blasphemy from those Catholic extremists. So my question is, why the New York Times is showing a cartoons or a painting when it do offend Catholic extremists, and why is not doing it when it do offend Muslims extremists? The only explanation to that is fear, is the cost of the insurance, is the fact that you can be killed for that. And I don't have any problem that they are saying it. Like the Jyllands-Posten said, after the 7th of January, they didn't show the cover of Charlie Hebdo. My colleagues have been killed because they did support the Jyllands-Posten. And the Yellen Post was not able to show the cover of Charlie Hebdo because they are so in danger, they are so afraid. But at least they admit that they didn't show the cover of Charlie Hebdo because they are too afraid. And this is the only honesty. We are asking for it, actually.
Sure.
Jean?
Well, I just want to say that we received some criticism when we posted that cover the day after it was published. And the only explanation, or not even explanation, but answer I had was that understand we're publishing this for the purpose of information, not insult. And we have an obligation, we're not a news organization, but we post front pages at the front of our building every single day that are newsworthy, and particularly when we choose the international publications, and this was clearly newsworthy. And we felt it was a necessity to do that there. And thankfully, we have not been subjected, at least yet, to the threats that you've faced and that your colleagues have faced. But I thought that was an important distinction to make, that our intent was information, whether it's satire, whether it's to provoke discussion. It was a legitimate purpose to inform people, and that we felt it had to be out there, along with the other front pages in the world reporting the incident.
So actually, there's one last issue I wanted to discuss with all of you, which is the kind of national security instincts and impact and consequences that we've seen since the Charlie Hebdo attacks, but also the terrorist attacks in November. And actually, the New York Times yesterday published an opinion piece expressing its extreme concerns towards the push to diminish civil liberties in France. And really, I want to ask the question of, are we getting to a worst French Patriot Act? Did we learn anything from what happened in the US with surveillance laws? And have you seen in France and in the US national security laws abusing basic freedoms, and then how it impacts journalists? So should we start with Caroline, Bob, Renaud?
I'm curious in terms of the election, since you're covering the candidacy. We've seen some candidates come out and say that they would restore some of the now limited surveillance proposals. So I suppose we're all over the map. But is there a general trend in what candidates today, what they feel they must say about national security that limits, even at the cost of limiting some freedom?
I think that the trend, at least that I've seen recently, is that they would do whatever is necessary to keep people safe, because that's the theme of this election is fear. That is, it's fear of the unknowns, it's fear of Muslims, it's fear of Black Lives Matters activists. It's just fear.
Immigration across the board.
Yeah, it's fear, which translates into anger. And so that's the overall theme that we've seen is like, we will do whatever it takes to keep you safe. Now, when you get into the nitty-gritties of it, that's when candidates and when voters get uncomfortable, because they say, I don't want you tracking me, but at the same time, after an attack happens, they say, well, how did we not know this was going to happen?
Yeah, why aren't you tracking them as opposed to me?
Well, and to pick up on that point, I mean, fear always erodes First Amendment values. We've seen it after any number of national crises, and we saw it after 9/11. And the National Security Agency apparatus that was built up to vacuum in all of the metadata from phone records. And while it looked like we were on a course towards some correction toward that, we still had a current administration that was issuing more subpoenas for journalists than any in history, and threatening prosecutions under the Espionage Act and so on. And now, finally, the NSA program has ended. That debate has been refreshed by the attack in Paris and other events, so that you now have presidential candidates saying that it's absolutely a mistake to rein in the NSA, that we need to have all kinds of limits, and including having registration for people of a certain faith and so on. So fear definitely is the theme, and it definitely has an adverse impact on civil liberties.
Caroline, how do you see the debate in France, in the French press, of like national security versus basic freedoms? Or
First, as you say, that really in France we love to debate. So be sure that debate a lot about those measures, anti-terrorist measures. It's kind of, honestly, most of the French today are really more concerned about facing the next attack and prevent it. Because we know that we have 5,000 probably radicals, almost 3,000 in Syria who can come back and do a terrorist attack. And we know that, the cat again, and we know that only it's a terrorist cat, apparently. Only 4 guys with Kalashnikov can kill more than 100 people. So honestly, today the first priority of most of the French is to have a better intelligence service who can prevent that. But in the left, and mostly in the left, of course, we are very concerned about not going too far in the name of this fear and this really important security situation. For example, there is a big debate about shall we or not put the emergency state measures inside the Constitution? So yes, we will continue to debate. Honestly, from the journalistic point of view, we are quite well protected. Today, if I compare my situation to the situation of many friends I have who are Algerian journalists, and I know that in the 90s, they did face these crazy, crazy times where they were under the threat of the terrorists. And at the same time, they were with this authoritarian state under their head. We can really do a lot of abuse in the name of fighting terrorism. We are not today in that situation. We can trust the state to be quite balanced about all of this. The situation we are more worried about, of course, if it is one day, you can imagine that if the terrorist attacks are continuing every month, in a few years, I don't know if we will be able to continue to stop the rising of the extreme right. I don't know. People are going to be really exhausted.
Yeah.
And in that, the extreme right can use some law very, very badly. But I want just to fill you more, because I'm hearing a lot of worries about France in the USA media. Be sure of that. Even Marine Le Pen in France cannot say something like Donald Trump just said during the campaign, listing people because they are Muslims. Of course, he would be sued. Of course, he will be under persecution from anti-racist organization. It's just not something we can even think during a campaign today. It's more than extreme right. It's just insane and racist.
So, Renaud, you studied pretty precisely the danger of these new security laws in
Yes.
France. So, what are your main concerns about this?
I mean, in fact, first, I think it's massive what's going on right now, because you have a project of reforming the constitution, which basically was announced a couple of days after the attack on November 13. That project contains 2 important measures, one which could strip binational of their citizenship, and another, I think, which is even more important, which would shield the search and seizures at night. That was a taboo in French law, no search and seizure between 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. And they want to shield those search and seizures from judicial control. This is really something. It's heavy. Then, I mean, if we look at the number of statutes that have been passed on anti-terrorism, I mean, it's under the Hollande government. It's actually 1 statute on anti-terrorism per year. And we have a new one which is announced for next year. But we have, I mean, a statute on intelligence that was passed in April, which basically allows the French government to place a secret algorithm. Opponents have called that a black box at internet provider, basically to have access to all the metadata of, I mean, that means right of surveillance on all the French public. Then you have, I mean, a statute on December 2014, which was statute passed to because a lot of young radicals are going to fight in Syria, and that statute, in fact, created the offense of individual terrorism. I mean, which basically for an American audience is basically to say that conspiracy requires only one person. That is, that's how inventive the government is. And then if you look, I mean, you had another statute after the Mera case in France that was, I mean, those assassinations of soldiers and Jewish population in 2012. You had under the Sarkozy government many statutes, not as, but at least, I mean, I think you have 4 under the Hollande government and 4 under the Sarkozy government, just on anti-terrorism. The common point between all those statutes, and that's where we see the biggest threat, is in fact, more and more we are moving to criminalize not activity, but intention.
Yeah.
This is where you are, I mean, this is where we are engaged on a very slippery slope. And it's changed from a criminal law, which was based on deterrence, retribution, to a criminal law which is based on some form of what we call algorithmic governmentality. It tries to basically preempt the act. It tries to, it's a predictive criminal law. This is really the trend. If you look at all those statutes, it's always about collecting more data to preempt the action. In fact, we translate, it's not we don't use, in fact, for example, in the law, another statute, November 2014, which extends the state with the state of emergency until February 26 and authorize certain derogatory measures against individual rights, you have a change of term from the prior law of 1955 on the state of emergency. The important term is to substitute the term activity for behavior. Now, it's mean if you have serious reason to determine that not an activity but a behavior is potentially dangerous, you can intervene, you can order search and seizure.
Yeah.
This is much more of a broad. And
so I think we will have to say goodbye to our C-SPAN audience, but of course now we can welcome questions from the audience, if there's any questions.
We'd invite you to come to microphones on the other side of the room if there are questions. If I could just, well, perhaps people are gathering a thought, just, you mentioned activity versus intention, and in the U.S. I think we'd phrase it conduct versus ideas.
Well, and beyond that, you have a continuum from conduct to words to thoughts.
And, you know, I think, again, one of the examples in our own history, going back to the Sedition Act, but going back to attempts by the great liberator Lincoln to restrain newspaper editors, to restrain ideas around World War I, World War II, we see these attempts to respond to fear by this sort of governmental intention to limit somehow an idea by preventing or jailing or imprisoning or banning the practitioners or the people who propose those ideas. And again and again, we learn the best antidote to ideas we don't like is to express the ideas we do like and to have some currency. We did a program in this room not long ago on battling ISIS in terms of this ability of ISIS to capture the attention of the world through the internet. And you know, we've done a program with the FBI director here being about their counterterrorism efforts. And you come back to one essential fact. The more information that is positive, that is at least truthful, is the best counter to all of this, that the attempt to restrain, to restrict, to ban, is either ineffective in the short or in the long term, and we've learned that in our history. And I think that's one of the great things that as we take the lessons of Charlie Hebdo, even facing these tragic murders and acts by terrorists, is that we cannot surrender that idea of safety over the idea of freedom. It has to be our ultimate defense. And we know from history that that ultimately is what triumphs.
And that idea translates beyond just safety, but also to the question of offensiveness.
Yes.
I mean, I think if you take the notion of the antidote to bad speech being more speech, and you take an example like the Westboro Baptist Church, this, of course, for people who aren't aware of it, is this little cult from Kansas.
Yes.
That believe that all of the ails that we face as a nation are due to the fact that we're too tolerant of homosexuality. And so their method of combating that was to protest at military funerals and other venues saying very hateful things. And the Supreme Court addressed the question of whether or not their speech was too outrageous and too harmful to be protected. So it takes that notion that you call hate speech and distills it into a very pure form. And the question is how you deal with that. To begin with, you have to ask yourself, are they really persuading anybody of anything? You take those messages out there, and it tells you that the marketplace of ideas isn't just their message that goes out unfiltered. The marketplace of ideas is not just what they say, but what others say in response and what the audience hears and comes away with. And so, allowing these people to spew this hatred didn't slow the drive in the United States toward marriage equality. It didn't cause people to be less tolerant. Instead, people saw them for what they were and made their own decisions. And in terms of the best antidote for hate speech being more speech, I think, well, two things really well illustrate that with the Westboro Baptist Church. One is whenever they would protest, you would see people with signs saying really funny and outrageous things in response. But more importantly, when the patriarch of that church died, outside his funeral, you had protesters, not even protesters, but people standing with signs saying, "We're sorry for your loss." What better response could there be?
Yeah.
So I think we will take the question, and then I will probably ask you to do some closing remarks with your last points you wanted to make today. Sir, please.
Yes, I'm Robert Destro. I'm a fellow here at the Museum Institute and a professor at Catholic U Law School. I wanted to ask you about coverage. And, most of the discussion today has focused on the victims. And what I'd like to ask you to address is why haven't we seen more coverage of the criminals? I believe, Professor Bouchard mentioned the question about these are criminals who were doing this. They're murderers. They've attacked, same weekend, they attacked a Jewish grocery store. And so why aren't we seeing in-depth coverage of who ISIS is? The assumption appears to be that they're right-wingers, but we don't really know who they are. And what I wonder is why the press isn't really covering who ISIS is.
I would argue that the press has been covering who ISIS is. I think one of the biggest barriers to it perhaps is the access. It's very difficult to get into Syria and Iraq where a lot of these militants are, but I would argue that there has been some really great coverage. One that pops to mind, and maybe because I'm friends with the authors, the Huffington Post published an investigative piece into the mothers of some of these European sons who have become ISIS militants, and how that process happened and why it happened. I think we're starting to see more of it, but I think you're right that there should be more coverage of it, but I think a lot of it is just the barriers to being able to go there and live through it and being able to go there and get access to them. But I think certain outlets like Vice News has done a lot of great coverage of actually getting in there. BuzzFeed as well, like I said.
The Atlantic
Yes.
did this big investigation, what ISIS really wants, which is...
And also, there's a real change in the posture of the ability of journalists to function now across the planet. And we're seeing it in the reports this year by Reporters Without Borders and Committee to Protect Journalists and others, where terrorism is down. It was 40%, I think, of CPJ's list that people were murdered directly by what they would call terrorists. And that is that journalists in the past were the mechanism by which your message got out. And so they were sort of a neutral party, even if they weren't truly neutral, but they were seen as a way to get your message out, and particularly if you were an insurgent group where you didn't have the power of the government to control or to at least insert themselves into the media of a country or a region. You needed those reporters to come in and talk to them, and reporters could go into an encampment of a rebellion or to a group that was, even a terrorist group, be invited in, because that was how you got your message out. Well, now it's not even a neutral circumstance for journalists anymore. It might have been needed in the past. They're not just neutral. They're now an antagonist to your ability to control the message about your group and to go directly via the web to take that message out. So one of the limitations that's come up, ironically, as a result of being able to communicate more information faster to a greater audience, is this ability of individual terrorist groups or whatever to get their own message out. So if you're a working journalist, you're no longer that necessity. You're really a threat. And I think that's also prevented a number of people from going into places where the ultimate violence is a daily occurrence.
Actually, we at Reporters Without Borders, we just published a report on Monday describing how ISIS, but also Al-Shabaab in Somalia or Boko Haram in Nigeria, are restricting the access to journalists, controlling the media, developing their own media, and how actually journalists become targets, and how violence become a message, especially violence against journalists. And actually in this report, we published the kind of commandments of ISIS towards journalists, and especially Iraqi and Syrian journalists working in the zone they control. And one of the first amendments, or commandments, say journalists who write against the Islamic State are considered enemy soldiers. So that just puts you in the perspective of these groups.
And I have to say that, in fact, a manual that was only proposed within the Pentagon on how to have what we would grown to call embedded journalists, actually identified journalists as potentially combatants because of the potential for them not to write on script. Now, that was withdrawn, and what's attention was called.
Hopefully withdrawn.
Someone did propose that within a report on how the U.S. developed its own media relations guidelines. So it's, obviously it was a lot less pejorative, and I think you were only banned from going. You weren't, there was no intention of harm. But still, it was that attitude that the media is now an antagonist, and that flow of information, that free flow of information, is somehow to be feared.
Renaud?
Just maybe a couple of words. I mean, in fact, you have had a lot of portraits of the lone wolf, particularly. I mean, Mehdi Memouche, Mera, and the Kouachi brothers, etc. So, in fact, I mean, there's no shortage. What I would really recommend to you is to read the articles by Olivier Roy about who is a candidate for radicalization. He identified that, in fact, his main thesis is to say that it's not radicalization of Islamism, but an Islamization of radicalization. And in fact, he explains that you have two particular groups that are concerned from French people, actually, in Europe. That's more like the second generation and the converts, which already the converts in the 90s, they were a large part of those who were going to fight in global jihad. So I think the thesis of Roy are very interesting in this respect.
So I think it would be time to conclude. I want to thank you again, Caroline, for staying with us through Skype. I wish you would have been with us, but I know you're really very demanded these days, and I really give you my best regards and all the best for the days to come in France. A lot of commemoration to come. Thank you again. I don't know if you have few words to say, but I want also to thank Adas, Bob, Jean, and Renaud for all being here today for this discussion. And I want to thank all of you for following us today for this discussion. And hopefully we will continue to discuss these freedoms actively. Thank you.